Hey, Nation, Harry here, back with Ken Dwight in humid Houston, Texas. We are turning the corner on mid-year. Can you believe it? Ken, can you believe it? It's already mid-year of 2020, and boy, howdy, what a year it's been. How you doing otherwise, though? You hanging in there?
I'm great. Yeah, I'm hanging in there, and I'm healthy and keeping pretty much my normal routine, and
Yeah,
just waiting for some of this hysteria to die down.
there we go. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm back in Seattle. It's still coffee time, so I'm doing the old keep calm and carry on coffee cup today. Well, Ken, it looks like we're going to talk about the anatomy of a ransomware attack. While I take a sip of coffee, tell us, give it your best shot. What do you got?
All right. Well, ransomware obviously is something we've been talking about for quite a while now, and it's been one of the biggest issues, and probably the biggest issue in terms of computer security for the last few years, ever since CryptoLocker came out in 2013. But people tend to think of ransomware as being a one-shot deal. You wake up one morning and your files are encrypted and you've got these ransom notes all over the place. And the reality is it's a much more involved procedure than that. There are multiple steps along the way. And some MSPs and computer techs are aware of this. Certainly most end users aren't. In fact, there's still, believe it or not, some end users that don't know what ransomware is. So that's how far out of it some end users are. But again, even IT support people and professionals don't know all the nuances, and there again, it changes a lot. So what I've done here is put together what I call the anatomy of a ransomware attack that really lays out the different steps that are going to take place in a ransomware attack. And out of all of this, what I'm presenting is not necessarily exactly how all of them work, but the point is, as ransomware has gotten more and more sophisticated, they've learned from each other. And so they keep doing more things, and they do it more effectively and more efficiently, and they're aware of some of the things that they need to do that they weren't taken care of in the early days. So the obvious first step in a ransomware attack is ransomware gets implanted on the target computer. It makes that initial penetration through whatever way. And here again, still most people think that that's usually through somebody clicking on an email with a malicious attachment or going to a bad website. And that certainly still happens, but depending on whose figures you look at and listen to, that may or may not be the major infection vector these days. There are two that have come along to really take the place of email as an infection vector, and in some cases it's much more prevalent. And one of those would be through RDP. With remote desktop protocol, in its native mode, the way that most people have it set up is very vulnerable. And there are a lot of things that can be done to protect against that. But the point is that at one time last year, one vendor indicated that 86% of the ransomware penetrations they saw started off with an RDP hack. So more recently, the RMM tools and other dashboards that MSPs use have been compromised in a lot of them in a lot of ways. And of course, once the bad guy gets into an MSP, they can in turn get all of that MSP's clients and their data files. So the point is there are a lot of infection vectors, but regardless of how it gets there, that's the first step in this chain of events. Usually the next thing they want to do is what they call establishing persistence. You hear the term advanced persistent threat, or APT. And what that indicates is that the bad guys don't want you to be able to just reboot and have their malware go away. And so there are a lot of ways that they can get in there and be sure that in spite of a reboot or running an antivirus program or whatever, they're going to keep coming back. So that's usually the next thing they do. In most cases, they'll go ahead and do whatever they can to harvest credentials, most of that being usernames and passwords, but it also might be email addresses or other things that they can either use themselves to log on as different users and maybe get different privilege levels, access to different resources or whatever. Or of course, they can always put that up for sale on the dark web for whatever additional revenue they can generate from that. There may be high value depending on who the target is and how much they've been able to successfully harvest. The next thing they'll usually do is if that user that they have infected happens to have non-administrator privileges, if they're a regular user or limited user or guest or something like that, obviously the bad guys can do more as administrator. And so the techniques for escalating that user they've infected to an administrator is pretty well known and pretty commonly used among the bad guys, so that again, they have much more latitude to do whatever they want to do. At that point, they do some pretty extensive reconnaissance. They're trying to find out more about who this computer is and who it belongs to that they now have a presence on. They're learning more about the company, the organization, the computing environment, the operating systems, the processors, the update levels, the anti-malware. There's a lot of things like that that will help them be more effective in actually creating the ransomware and getting to the point of being able to monetize it and make the victim pay. So this may take certainly at least a few hours, but more commonly it's measured in days or even weeks, and there's some that have actually stayed there for months before there were any obvious symptoms of an infection. That's what's known as the dwell time. And I'd say on average, that dwell time is going to be probably, and I don't know exactly, but I'm guessing probably 2 to 3 weeks would be the average dwell time. From the bad guy's standpoint, the longer they can stay on there and do all this reconnaissance, the more they potentially stand to gain. On the other hand, the longer they're on there, the higher the likelihood that something will detect their presence and get rid of them. So it's kind of a balancing act they have to play to figure out where the risk reward makes the most sense for them. But just from the stories I hear, I would say that on average, you're talking a few weeks worth of dwell time before the user sees any obvious symptoms, or even some of their monitoring tools pick up on the idea that they have been penetrated. Next, and this won't always happen, but this is about where it would usually happen, spread laterally across the network. What other computers are on the network, especially what other servers or high value users. Obviously, the more computers they can infect and get the malware on, the higher their potential payoff may be. On the other hand, it does require some technical expertise, and once again, there's more possibility of hitting a tripwire that would set off an alarm saying, hey, there's an intruder in the network. So that's why I say they may or may not. It's just a value judgment that they have to make as far as what's in their best interest. Probably the next thing that's going to happen is they'll communicate with the command and control server. The command and control server is some remote computer that's controlled by the person behind the ransomware. And that's where they get further instructions, what to do, what kind of harvesting to do, what kind of things to look for, and ultimately the encryption key. So when it comes time to actually encrypt the data, which has not happened yet, that's the encryption key that they'll use, and some mechanism of remembering what encryption key was used for what infected user. The next thing they will probably do, here again, they won't always, but especially recently, in the last 6 months to a year, this has become more common. They will exfiltrate or steal as much of that original unencrypted data as they can. And one reason for doing that would be to give them one more way of being able to restore the data if the victim does pays the ransom. In most cases, the ransomware providers do want to get that user's data back, so the word will get around, well, if you pay the ransom, then they'll work with you and get your data back. And most of them recognize that their decryption process is not always perfect. So having an unencrypted copy of the files I can restore from gives them another way of providing that better customer service, for lack of a better term. But possibly more importantly these days, it's another resource they can monetize. For one thing, if the user already has good backups, they don't have to pay the ransom to get back to being able to pick up their business. Then they can just tell the ransomware people to take a hike. There's no reason for them to pay the ransom. On the other hand, the bad guys can say, okay, if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to publish your data. We're going to put it out on the web for everybody to see. And there's, of course, the possibility that's some confidential or high value data. At the very minimum, it would be embarrassing to let the world know they've been hacked and been the victims of a ransomware attack. And so it's bad PR, and in a lot of cases, they were required by some regulation or some policy of an organization, whether it's a CPA or an attorney or healthcare or whatever. If they haven't reported that breach, then they can get in additional problems and face fines, as well as the damage to their reputation. So unfortunately, this is a very effective thing the bad guys can do to make more money from the ransomware attack, even if the victim can get their data back without having to pay the ransom. And of course, even if they do pay the ransom, there's still no guarantee that their data won't be released or sold. At that point, Next thing they want to do is make sure that once the encryption is done, then any of the easy ways that the user may have of getting that data back are gone. So at that point, they'll delete the volume shadow copies and delete or encrypt any backups they can find. And of course, they know all the common backup programs, their executables, what the data files look like, and they can easily encrypt them or delete them, whichever they choose to do. But the point is, if the user gets real smug and says, we don't have to pay the ransom, we've got backups, then they check and see that their backups are gone or that they've been encrypted too. Then that gives the bad guys another big, strong lever to get the victim to pay up. At that point, one more thing they'll do is disable whatever anti-malware protection or any other internet security that may be on the system to look for things like encryption or other indicators of compromise. Now, this is something I figured out how to do a long time ago. In fact, I became a virus doctor in 2002. And prior to that, I remember a Windows 98 client that got infected. I don't remember what the malware was, but one of the first things it did was disable their Norton antivirus. And we couldn't reinstall it, couldn't get the definitions updated or anything. So that's something they've known how to do for a long time. So the point is, once they disable whatever security products they can, then they encrypt the data files. At that point, it's less likely that encryption will be detected or blocked. And so they figure they're in the home stretch. Now, the encryption itself it'll take some amount of time, whether that's 10, 15, 20 minutes or an hour. It could even be days, depending on the speed of the machine, the particular number of files, whether it's a spinning hard drive or an SSD. There are a lot of variables. But worst case, it might take them a couple of days. More commonly, within a few hours, all that encryption has been done. Once it's done, different families of ransomware have different attitudes in terms of what they do from this point forward. Some of them will leave that encryption process running. So any new files the user creates or changes, if they happen to have one that didn't get encrypted and can still change it, or if they create a new one, then it'll get encrypted as well. On the other hand, that's another way that the bad guys could give away some of their secrets. And so in a lot of cases, they'll go ahead and kill and delete that encryption process. So if the user runs an anti-malware program scanning for malware, they're not going to find that malicious process. So again, it may or may not still be running, but you certainly need to figure that out as part of the process. Then and only then, that's where the user sees the ransom notes. And the ransom notes will generally be in every folder that contains encrypted data files, certainly on the workstation and on the server as well, if, as is usually the case, it had access to the server and that's where their files are stored. So even though the server may have ransom notes on it, it may or may not be infected. It may not have been the original source of the encryption. But that's the whole timeline of a ransomware attack. There are actually 13 separate steps involved there. And again, a particular piece of ransomware may or may not follow all those steps, and the sequence may vary a little bit. But the point is, there are a lot of places along the way that with the appropriate tools, with the appropriate awareness, and paying attention to some of the things that are going on, you might be able to detect it, intercept it, and shut the encryption down before it does any permanent damage or gets the user or the victim in the position of having to consider paying the ransom or dealing with the ransomware provider.
Yep.
How
many steps again? Yeah, you made mention of steps. How many steps again, roughly, did we just review?
There are 13. There are actually 5 on the first slide and 4 each on the second and third.
Wow, lucky number 13. Imagine that.
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, I appreciate your contribution, ongoing contribution, right? You've been very generous with your time as we go through this, and we're all in this together. Still love that trademark, man. Don't ever give up that trade. Or I'll put it this way: if you give up that trademark, call me confidentially.
All right. Well, it's always a pleasure. And you give me the incentive to put some of this stuff in writing and in a form that is more accessible to more people, which is what I'm here for.
Exactly. And here's to a good second half of 2020, my friend. We're turning the corner on that. we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for being a contributor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Harry. Always a pleasure. And stay safe. Have a great second half of 2020.
All right. Bye-bye.